Welcome today to our discussion on peace building in the era of climate crisis. I'm very, very happy that we have been able to hold this event, which we already postponed, and I'm also very aware that it's difficult today to talk about different topics than what is happening in Ukraine right now. I think every one of us is shattered and what is going on, a war in Europe. And even though we are all devastated, we can see, and it's also important that there are still so many other problems which are ongoing, even though with all the drama what is now happening in Europe. I'm still happy that we can talk today also about peace building in the era of climate crisis with our partner organization, the Agency for Peace Building based in Italy, in Bologna, represented by you, Bernardo. I'm very happy that you managed to come to Vienna to travel. It's a pleasure. I look forward to future cooperation, so welcome from our side. And I would also like to welcome Hannes SWOBODA, who is the president of our institute. He used to be a member of the European Parliament for more than 14 years and has, I would say, a long-standing experience when it comes to foreign politics and all different issues. We are talking today about the impact of climate crisis when it comes to peace building. But of course, I mean, we will also need to tackle what is going on now in Europe, because this also has impacts on the global south, maybe, and we will come back to that later. Climate change affects, I would say, even disproportionately the world's most vulnerable populations already. If we look at the peacekeeping missions, 6 out of the 10 biggest UN peacekeeping activities are based in countries of the global south, and especially to those countries which are exposed mostly to the climate crisis. And I think this is something we should also always keep in mind. What I think is very interesting that when we talk about climate crisis and peace building, we try today to give it like a different narrative a little bit. We do not want to talk only about security, but also about peace, and I think this is also a very important issue. Today, we try to discuss how can climate change add to the occurrence of armed conflicts or even aggravate existing conflicts. But we will also look at it if it probably even can try to support when it comes to communication, when it comes to cooperation. I mean, it also might even offer different perspectives on how to combat what is going on these days. I would like to start with you, Bernardo. And my first question to you would be, since your agency did this huge report on this issue, I mean, maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what your organization has been doing. What was difficult? What are the main findings? What is it about? And how is this nexus between climate crisis, environment, and peace building from your point of view? Please.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and good evening to everyone, to the people here in the room and the people connected online. I'm really glad, as you said, that we can do it today and we have this space to reflect on an important issue. Climate change was on the top, on the news just a few weeks ago, and everyone was discussing in Glasgow and so on. So I think it's important to keep the attention on this issue. As an agency for peace building, we decided last year to focus on this issue in our main event that took place in May, the Bologna Peacebuilding Forum, and we really discussed the nexus between peace building and climate crisis. So the idea was not, as you said, just to focus on security, broadly speaking, but to see how it's possible to work on peace in a changing environment, and how the peace work is affected by this change as well. The first issue that we learn is that it's important not to generalize, that many conflict and war are multi-layered, and there are so many causes affecting them, and the answer should always be tailor-made. And I mean, climate crisis can really deteriorate the situation, but often, I mean, the main causes are others, are more at the political, the social level, and so on. What we also learn is that climate change is heavily affecting the most fragile part of the society. So if the people are already with limited resources, some changes and in particular the unpredictability of the climate change can really change and affect them, as well as the extreme events in the region. So, for instance, what we have seen in the Sahel region, that was one of the main discussed during the forum, and this is part also of my research background, is that unpredictable rainfalls can change how the pastoralists are moving around. So the season moving can be anticipated, for instance. And that can create some collision and conflict with other categories, like the herders and farmers. So they are already in a situation of fragility due to the situation in the Sahel, the ongoing terrorist attack, the jihadi movements that are taking place there. And the correlate that was demonstrated is that during a scarce rain season, the recruitment of armed group is increasing because the situation is getting worse, and the people in need really need to get something for their family, so they move toward some armed group. So that's a limitation of resources can really create this kind of situation. Another thing that I would like to mention is the relation between the climate expert and the peace and security sectors. Because on the one hand, we have scientists that are really expert and they know about the climate. And on the other, we have politicians and scholars and practitioners that are more international relations, peace studies, and so on. And we have seen through the years how there is a gap between the two communities. It's important that they really speak and work together. An example that I have seen that is rather impressive is about the Lake Chad, that was considered as shrinking. Here we are still are in the Sahel. You know, the Lake Chad is between Chad, Cameroon, Niger, and Nigeria. And for many years was considered as shrinking and drying and so on. And so many, even the UN report, World Bank report, were mentioning this year that lake was shrinking. But at the end of the day, I mean, it was never demonstrated scientifically. But that was affecting many analyses and many choices on the ground by international organizations. And the recent publication on Nature and some other demonstrated with some satellite images taken with very deep analysis of the last 30, 40 years that basically the lake is not shrinking, but are more seasonal courses of the place. So that is not, I mean, it's not how we consider and how we consider climate change in the region can really change how we analyze it and how we deal with even with local groups. And we know that the main issue over there is related to an extremist group that is Boko Haram. And Boko Haram is strong there because, I mean, they can really rely on some poor people that cannot have resources to do anything else but ask the support of this group. So it's really important to look at this connection. The same for desertification in the Sahel, that for a very long time was presented as a trend, that actually was a trend in the 60s and the 70s. So it was really a really scarcity of rain in the 60s and the 70s in the Sahel, but the trend has changed recently, and desertification seems more, I mean, a Western perspective, like to draw that region as a constantly deteriorating region from all point of view, also from environmental point of view. But actually, it's not the case. It's not the case. So when we discuss about this region, we really have to be aware about the potential stereotypes and really double check the data and to compare them with our analysis and with the social and political considerations.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. I mean, Hannes, what you have been now hearing, when we talk about climate crisis and peace building, what comes to your mind immediately? I mean, you have been working for so many years in the European Parliament, and I would say we saw a shift recently in the last 20 years that especially the climate agenda is very prominent within the European Union as well. I mean, we talk about the Green Deal, we see like a lot of impacts when it comes to climate crisis. Also in Europe, it's not only a problem, of course, when it comes to the African countries, even though so many peace-building efforts are there. But I mean, we especially also know from the Western Balkans how pollution is also affecting the liveliness. And I also recently read in a policy paper of the in an article in Foreign Policy that military solutions won't end terrorism also in the Sahel, which is also what you have been mentioning. But addressing the environmental factors destroying livelihoods and fueling extremist groups' recruitment probably could. Hannes, what would you say to these issues?
Yeah, I would say there are two conclusions I would draw from what Bernardo just said. The one is it's a very complex relationship between climate change, poverty, political radicalism, fanaticism, and agricultural conflicts between different types of agricultures and so on. And the second is, of course, we need a very exact documentation what is really happening, because when you spoke about the Chad Lake Chad, I remember I don't remember the name, but the activist from Uganda who is very strong on the issue of climate change in Africa. For her, it was one of the examples was the shrinking Lake Chad and the shrinking water there. So I think it is important to be exact also in this debate, because otherwise the opponents of a climate policy can tell you, look, you are wrong, because it's not really shrinking, or there is not really that kind of desertification. Today I read an article about drought in Morocco. It seems to be, for the moment, a very bad economic situation. We also had the locusts in the eastern part of Africa. So it's not only one element, but it's different elements, and we have to be very concise. Coming back to the first point on the complexities and what you mentioned, Stephanie, I mean, the problem is that very often, especially in politics, in order to reduce this complexity, you have one point. You say, okay, we have to send the military to fight against Boko Haram or against the jihadis in Mali. And then only you come, maybe there are other effects as well. Maybe education is a problem, maybe poverty is a problem, maybe, as was told, these conflicts between different types of agriculture, you know, peasants moving around or peasants who are settled and stay at the same time. And if there is a very flux and irregularity in rainfall, then of course it distorts the whole situation. So this is one mistake, I would say, from European politics, especially some politicians. Look, for example, France activities, but also EU activities with the military in Mali and in other areas, where they say we go in and we fight, and then everything will be okay, because we don't fight the roots and the causes of extremism, we fight the extremists. Sometimes, of course, you have to fight the extremists, but that cannot be the only thing. You only have to look to the roots. But I think, and Bernardo knows much more about that, because also now in Mali we have these coup d'etats, we have military taking power, and then military asking perhaps other groups like the Wagner group or from Russia and so on. So it is difficult for the European Union with whom to ally, with whom to cooperate, because you have to cooperate with the government in order to fight extremism. But if the government is not doing its job by creating the economic and social conditions to minimize at least the influence of the extremists, of the jihadis, then you cannot really have a result. And this is the disaster of many of the European engagements, especially in the Sahel zone, and specifically now in Mali, that we don't have a partner to do we don't do the right fight, maybe, probably in some respect, but we don't have the partner with whom we can really go to the roots of the cause and not just the phenomenon on the top of it.
Thank you, Hannes. When we talk about climate crisis, we also talk a lot about resources, and we also talk a lot about resource-based conflicts. And as we also know, I mean, there are so many resource-based conflicts, especially also in those countries which have already weak governments. And they do ally a lot also with companies who are extracting these resources, and this is also very problematic from a climate perspective. Bernardo, how do you see like these resource conflicts when it comes to peace building, and how do you see the discussion about this? Does peace building even play a role when it comes to these issues?
I do think that plays a role, and it's important to address that directly. Resources is, in general, raw materials, for instance, is a big issue for conflict. And it's not about scarcity. It's really about how they are managed. And as you said, the main issue are when we have a weak government, when the governance is corrupted, and when really the situation on the ground can deteriorate rapidly. In some African countries, I mean, the local people are mining gold, are mining other raw materials, and that's create and are irregular mining, and that's create, I mean, a disparity, because big companies are coming and making unfair agreements with the government because the governments are weak, are corrupted, and so the local people organize themselves and they try to do that. And there are dozens of local mining, for instance, in the Sahel countries, for instance, in Niger, and that creates really a mess. And also in the relation with some foreign power, you mentioned that the Russian Federation and the Wagner Group, and I mean, that's part of the bargain, to pay them directly with mining, and that it creates really what the African country should avoid, to use the raw materials that are really rich and powerful for their future in this way. So I think the peacebuilding community should really address some issue directly, and at the same time connected to climate change. I think that scarcity can be an issue, especially for the situation of fragility. So when some people really live with limited resources and they are getting down, so their life is in danger. But at the same time, I don't think that the opposite is true, that the abundance of resources is enough to guarantee peace. We have seen, I mean, I recently read a report by the International
investors from the outside and extracting the resources. We know it from Nigeria, from the Niger Delta, and from other areas where a lot of money is made, but it's not dispersed to the people who are living there. And even the environment is damaged very much. Again, now there was recently a judgment, I think, by Dutch courts that Shell, I think, has to pay a lot of compensation. So slowly it starts the consciousness that even if there's a contract, and I don't want to look into the way the contract was concluded between some officials and some representatives of the big companies, even if it is legally okay, it does not mean that the damage and the disaster created by some of these investments can be done without compensation to the local population. But of course, there's also the conflict between different resources by the people themselves. Let's look at what was mentioned on the mining issue. On the one hand, you have the regular mining, probably in some way with some respect to the environment. At least it could be organized. On the other hand, you have this irregular mining, which is more giving money more to the people who do it. Also, very often they do it also on behalf of companies from the European continent. So it's not only a small-scale individual business, but they are doing it for regular companies who say, okay, I have my black market with these small companies who are individuals who do this irregular mining. And very often, of course, environmental concerns are less respected by these individual miners because they don't have the money to do it. They just do this irregular mining. So we have this double thing, double element of regular mining, of course, with exploitation, sometimes even child labor, and then you have the irregular mining, often very even more environmental damaging. And then I want just to mention the issue. Our transition to sustainable energy or to electrification and e-mobility is very much connected with mining also in Africa. For example, cobalt in Congo. And very often we are happy about, we are more cleaner now, we have e-mobility, and we no longer have oil used for our cars. But in fact, maybe it is a bit more clean, but in fact it's very much connected with mining and mining activities which are not very clean, or not very social, especially also on this issue. But even for cacao, for chocolate, if we eat it, it's very much dependent what the companies do in order to raise the income of the peasants there. So our living standard and even our energy transition is very much connected with mining activities in Africa, but also in Latin America and other regions. So we should be aware that we shouldn't be too proud if we make our environmental clean strategy or implement it if it is dependent on sometimes not very clean and not very social activities of our companies in our neighboring continent.
I think that's a very important point also to mention. What I think, and it made me quite happy, is when we got in contact about let's do something together on climate crisis and peace building. I was very happy that you mentioned the word peace, because normally we talk so much about security. And especially in Europe, when we talk about the climate crisis, we talk about migration, we talk about that the impact the climate crisis has on food security, for example, in the Horn of Africa, which makes people migrate, and we talk about, and then we also did in the European Union, especially since 2015 when the huge influx came, we suddenly also separated refugees, and we started calling them not refugees but climate migration, economic migrants, and then political migrants. So how do you think, how important is also wording? I mean, how important is the shift also to talk about climate crisis, not only in the sense of security relations, but also when it comes to really efforts in peace building? What would you say to that?
Yeah, thanks for this question, because it's really broadening the picture, and I think it's paramount to discuss about a broader understanding of peace and not just of hard security. And I want to connect what we just discussed about environmental degradation. That is not just climate, it's the environment. And when we have a situation of environmental degradation, that's affecting the life of the people directly, and is really affecting the climate as well. But we still have now is really is fascinated to discuss about climate change and climate crisis. But I think we still have to consider the whole picture. So some natural disaster, as the ones that you mentioned, are not related to climate change. Are really related to environmental degradation. So that's an important issue, and it's hard to live in some places. If I think to Nigeria, for instance, to the Niger Delta, I mean, when there is this kind of manufacturing, and it's really the environment is so polluted, it's impossible to live there, and the people get sick so quickly. So that's an important connection, and I would like to mention that, connected also to the idea of human security. That is not a new one, it's back to the 90s. Some scholars consider that as like hot air and just some really vague. But I do think that is important, because the first idea of human security was, and again, is more than 20 years old, to keep at least 5-6 dimensions of security together. And one of them is our environmental security. And so it was really before the mainstreaming of the discussion on climate change. And I think it's important, because we can have a state that is extremely secure when the army is strong, when the institutions are stable, but the economic situation can be really bad, the social condition can be really deteriorating, in the environment as well. So we really have to consider different factors affecting security. Security is not just borders, not just the army. And an example, for instance, is about the Chernobyl disaster. So back in time, the Soviet Union, when I mean, the Soviet Union at the beginning was denying what happened, and they said, we are secure, there is no issue. So they were not collapsing. The state was stable, the institution was stable, but at the same time, I mean, the situation of the ground was really terrible, and was affecting not just the former Soviet space, but even, I mean, here in Austria, in Italy, and Central Europe, and so on. So from that example, we see how the government can react and say we are secure, but security, if you think to security from different dimensions, you see that they were not secure at all. And secondly, we see how security not just staying the border. So environment is not about border. Environment degradation is not stopping at the border and asking for the passport. It's moving and crossing by through rivers, through the air pollution, and so on. I mean, it's the same for, you mentioned the migration. I mean, and I think it's correct to discuss about climate migration. It makes sense to open this chapter and say, look, can we have a status? And I think for some islands, for some situation where the situation really deteriorating, it makes sense to have this kind of status of environmental refugees or something like that, without labeling, of course, but recognizing that the situation is deteriorating. And I think we should also consider that, always in the perspective that we said at the beginning, that is multi-layered and complex, and so on.
Thank you, Hannes. Maybe you also have some ideas on this whole nexus when it comes to climate degradation, which then leads to food shortages, which then lead to migration. How do you assess this, especially from a European Union point of view, and what happened recently in the European Union? I mean, this discussion about economic migrants, about climate migrants. How would you assess this situation? Do you think that there is a discussion ongoing, or is it just we leave it at our borders, it's too far away, and it does not really concern us at all? Do you think there is more discussion needed? Also when it comes probably to a legal point of view, to what possibilities do those people actually have fleeing from hunger because they are starving?
I think if the real living conditions are destroyed, of course, it's a good reason to migrate and to accept this migration. We have it especially, of course, in the coastal zones. If we think about Bangladesh, we have it in other areas. The problem is, of course, how to define it. It's easier to define, already some difficulties to define when there is persecution, when people are killed by the state, and more or less all our definitions is based on a state is persecuting a person and he has the right to be accepted as a refugee. Like now with the Ukraine, we will come back to that later. So this is one of the issues, of course. I fear, because I mentioned Ukraine, that with a lot of migration now from Ukraine, at least to some countries, that migration issue will be more and more concentrated on internal migration in Europe. By the way, anyway, vast majority of migration, if it is enforced migration or not, is not happening from poor countries to rich countries, from Africa to Europe, and even not from Asia to Europe, but most of migration is from poor country to another poor country. It's from Bangladesh to Pakistan, or from Bangladesh to India, or it's African countries. So we should recognize here in Europe that we until now got a very small percentage of the world migration which is taking place because of political elements, because of war, because of conflicts, because also of environmental degradation. So you are absolutely right. I would agree that one should raise the issue of migration because of severe environmental degradation, but I fear that Europe is concentrated on other issues now, on its internal migration in Europe, and that subject will be not high on the agenda.
Yes, I agree, and I think we also see it recently, because I think 2 days ago there was the World Climate Report was published, and it actually said that the situation is even way worse than we thought. I think it did not, because of what is happening in Europe, it did not really attract a lot of attention. And then we have already today been discussing before about how big the attention was to climate crisis in the Fridays for Future movement, and the big role also the youth played there. I mean, how do you see the role of the youth these days when it comes to the climate crisis? I mean, can this give us hope for the future? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an important point. I think the youth are really pushing for a change, and before COVID we have seen impressive movements. I attended couple of marches in Italy, and there were really teenagers leading the marches, and very smart moves, with nice and smart ideas and posters and banners. So I think it's a beautiful movement. It's a beautiful movement, and it's really focused on their future. After this couple of years that we are more locked in our house, I have the impression, I was reading an article where a psychologist was describing how the teenager are really losing faith for the future, because they feel that the situation is deteriorating, as you said. They are very young, and they don't see space for personal, common projects in front of them. So we really have to worry about that, and really have to listen to them and to give them the right space, continue to give them the right space. I was glad in Glasgow that they started to have some spaces, not just consulted, but really in the rooms to discuss, and they took part of the process, and it's a good move. And I think it we have to learn in the peace community from that process. There is a UN Security Council resolution, the 2250 about 55 about youth, peace and security, and basically is saying similarly to what the 1325, the women, peace and security is saying, to have more youth in the room and to involve them in the whole peace processes. And if I think to many conflicts, especially in Africa, I mean the youth are really the 80–90% of the country, and often they are addressed only as a problem, as the people taking arms, as the people fighting, as the people that should be disarmed and reintegrated and so on. So always from a negative perspective, as it was, I mean, to some extent with women that were just considered as victims and not as the actors that can lead to peace as well, can mediate, can lead the peace process and so on. So it's rather similar now with youth in the peace sector, that we consider them as perpetrators or victims, and we don't consider them as important actors that can lead to peace processes as well. So I think we have to learn from what is going on climate in the peace sector, and perhaps also to connect the two issues and to work together with them to give them hope for the future.
Thank you. I think we should also talk a little bit about the situation right now, what is going on in Europe, and the war Russia launched on Ukraine, which so many of us did not see coming in this scale, at least. I mean, not in this scale. We all know, and Europe has been discussing this a lot, is especially also the dependence on oil and gas when it comes to Russia. We've been talking a lot about renewable energies, but what we do not really talk about is that these things actually might have impacts also on African countries when it comes to prices, for example, and this then of course also does affect food security. Again, Hannes, how would you assess the situation now with the war ongoing? What does it mean also for the global south, maybe not only for Europe, but then also again, the question about renewable energy. Is it possible for us to have this Europe where we can count on our own resources, where we are independent more or less from Russian gas, for example?
Well, first of all, yes, the war as such is terrible, and it's devastating, and it's cruel and brutal. But of course, we also have to discuss the consequences. One of the consequences, of course, in the public mind is what Bernardo just said. COVID was drawing the attention away from climate change and was pacifying in some way, or making passive the youngsters. I still remember when people criticized here, at least in Austria, maybe in some other countries, you cannot miss school if you go for demonstration, that's not good. They missed a lot of school afterwards because of COVID, which was the real problem for them, but also the psychological issue, what you mentioned. Many had this kind of depression even, because they had no contact with their colleagues, they could not go for a party, whatever. So it is really a disaster. Now we have the other issue, the war, which is also drawing attention away from the environmental issue. The real effect, of course, we will have, with high probability, even further rise of energy price, also of food price. Think about that two major or big producer of wheat, Ukraine and Russia, are in a war with each other. Corn is very much produced also in Ukraine, so it will be a disaster from this element. Fertilizers, where you need gas, already now are very expensive and will be more expensive. Not that they always well used, but anyway, for some production it will be necessary. So I fear that energy and food prices will rise dramatically. And wheat and corn you need also for growing beef and other meat production. So even if we plea for eating less meat, it will be a problem for many countries. Now, some countries may even benefit. You know, if you are a gas-producing country, also in Africa, oil and gas, it will be of benefit for you. I still remember that some weeks ago there was a discussion with some of the African countries and European Union, because the European Union would like to help countries in exploration for gas. Now maybe we need it, at least as a transition or bridge technology. So this is one of the issues that for already poor countries who don't have these resources in their soil or in the sea across the coast, it will be even a high burden. The debt rate will rise again. It's already now. The president of the World Bank raised recently the issue of the high debt of many countries, many African, also other from the other countries with the low income. So this will be an issue. We know already from China also that they are pressing some of the countries to pay back their debt. But this is one issue. Coming to Europe, for some countries like Austria, it will be difficult because Russian gas is the high percentage of the gas. It is good for the transition, but you need time for the transition. When I see that, on the other hand, there are, understandable or not, many opposition, there's a lot of opposition against wind parks and against hydro energy, new hydro energy, or against solar panels on the different areas where agriculture is grown now. It is easy to say, yeah, okay, let's put up a lot of wind farms and solar panels, but the opposition by local communities is very strong. In the west of Austria, there is no one wind farm, or so it will be difficult. In the east, you have a lot of them, but here the regions, take the example of Austria, already saying we have enough. Do it in the other areas where there are not any wind farms. So this can bring conflicts and a threat for peace in our own countries. So, of course, the problem with the poor countries is much bigger than with us. But I see a lot of conflicts coming on us, to us, in the coming years until we come to a real transition of our energy production, which needs some time, especially, of course, in big cities where you cannot just change from one day to another energy if your house is heated by gas. And if the ministers now say, well, the consumers will not suffer, we will reduce the gas consumption in industry, then the jobs will suffer. Because if you don't have gas in the industry, that may suffer. But again, the real problem worldwide is a new division between some countries who will gain from Saudi Arabia, maybe even to Nigeria, but many countries who will lose. And even, last point, in the countries where they gain, who gets the money? Who gets the money from oil exploitation and gas exploitation in many of the countries? It's not the broad population. It's not that they are compensated for some sufferings, as you mentioned also before, but it's again this kind of Dutch disease, what's called, that means that some oligarchs or groups and friends of the presidents and so on, or the kings get the money. So maybe new endangers for peace and stability in some of the countries, even who get richer, and not only the countries who get poorer.
When we talk about the climate crisis, we often hear, and all the climate experts are convinced since many years, that it's actually already super late. So we should have done many years ago, and we are still, the COP22, it happened, but still the outcome could have been better. And now we know, that China, for example, has a lot of emissions. Russia has like all those industrial countries to have, and the impact is felt mostly in regions which are not really have those amount of emissions. On the other hand, I mean, we also know that it's a global problem. We need to work together globally in order to do something to put a halt on that. And now we see what is happening, especially also in Russia, how difficult this is going to be even in the future. How can you even think about now about having a conversation with Russia on how to deal with climate change, for example? But the question is a bit provocative, but do you think this is still, we need to do it because we need to work together, like even with regimes we totally more or less despise for their actions, but nevertheless, I mean, we need to cooperate. Is there still, in your point of view, a possibility that we manage this in this political world nowadays?
Yeah, I think so. I really think so. Because perhaps we don't like it, but the people living in democracy in the world are less than the people living under authoritarian regime. So the number of authoritarian regime is still very high. And we cannot say, oh, we will not discuss with them. We know China, we know Russia, and many others in Asia, in Africa, and so on. So we don't need to compromise on some issues, of course, in terms of human rights and so on. But at the same time, we need to keep some channels of dialogue and work together, even very technically, on some precise issues, and the dialogue should continue. And I think climate is one of these areas that can be continue to be covered. And of course, in these days, it's difficult to talk about that and to think about a multilateral world where the people sit and gather together and discuss and find solutions to common problems. That's really hard to think. But I think it's the only way. Maybe the multilateral system will change. The UN will change, but some ways to discuss and to find some agreements are mandatory. Otherwise, there is no future. And let me conclude with another remark. That is the connection between the military system, the militarization, and the environmental consequences. We have many examples of greenwashing in the private sector. You mentioned oil companies and now really greenwashing to some extent in order to continue to produce and to work on oil and gas, but at the same time to have a percentage of renewable or some small project on another issue. I think it's the same for the military system. We see in Italy and in other countries how, I mean, they discuss a lot about how to reduce some emissions and so on. But how the military system is built sometimes, I mean, it's already really contributing strongly to environmental degradation through training, through exercise, through a lot of things. And we should also consider that dimension. Of course, when there is a war, the main consequences, unfortunate and dramatic, is for the people on the ground. But the whole apparatus is really dangerous for the system. Now there is a nuclear threat as well, and Putin discussed about that. But let's think, for instance, also to Ukraine and the power plants, the nuclear power plants. There are 12 or 14 nuclear power plants that are, I mean, what is going on with an occupation now? Who will take care of them? Are really dangerous for the environment. And I mean, so the whole military system and military apparatus sometimes, I mean, really need to deal also with these environmental issues, not just in terms of greenwashing or reducing a little bit emission, but more drastically.
Thank you for raising this issue. I think it's very important, especially nowadays, as we are talking again about more armament within the European Union. I mean, we know that Germany just said they probably might add another $100 billion in their defense capabilities. And even if it's understandable these days, when you look at what is going on, and it depends on, of course, on the viewpoint you have. For me as a peace person, armament is always a little bit problematic. But if you look at how quickly people can allocate money for defense, and just imagine they would do the same amount for climate and for combating the climate crisis. But this is not happening because it's not giving you this imminent threat perspective. Hannes, maybe your thoughts on the militarization and how this affects, and why are we so slow when it comes to the climate crisis, even though people are for years now telling us how extreme it is going to be, what it will lead to, refugee flows and disasters you have mentioning before, like all those disasters and tsunamis and storms and hurricanes.
Well, I think for combating and mitigating climate change or the deterioration of the climate, you need a transition and transformation of the society. It's not, you cannot just add money and that's it. You have to change your habits, your attitudes. For militarization, it's easy, relatively easy. You just have some companies who are eagerly waiting already, and you see it in Germany. Some companies already said, here I am, I can produce, I can strongly extend the production very soon. This is one of the issues. The second issue, of course, is what would be important if you say a united Europe, or NATO. It's crazy that you still have so many individual national armies. Instead of cooperating and saving some money, if you do, let's say, a coordinated activities, we don't need more arms. We need a much better coordination of the armament programs of the different countries. So you could save money, or at least you could spend the same amount of money in a much more effective way. Anyway, it's not about Germany fighting against Russia, or if Russia would invade, let's say, in the Baltic nations. It's anyway, it would be NATO. It is one organization. So one of the biggest mistakes is that still also on the army, you still have this kind of national orientation, different arms, very often not compatible. And even if NATO has some activities like we saw it on the Balkans, there is very much limitation because of the national limitations you have. And Srebrenica, for example, this big disaster, is one because according to the UN, but also especially to the Dutch rules, it was not possible to intervene and to prevent the child of genocide. And nobody was courageous enough to say, whatever the rules are, I have now to intervene to save the life of the people. So I think, I fear that this whole debate about armament is not going in the right direction. Yes, I fully agree that you should have a strong opposing force against, unfortunately, somebody like Putin. But it should be done if you are speaking about Europe, it should be done in a European way, not only in a national way in Germany, in a national way in Italy, in France, and so on. Not speaking about atomic bombs, because I know this is the big sensitivity, especially of the French, that they don't want to share the atomic weapons with others. Okay, but there's many other issues without the atomic bombs. It's about tanks, it's about surveillance, and of course, it's also more and more about cyber weapons. And here you would, of course, need international rules, but of course, if somebody is not sticking to the rules and misusing cyber weapons in order to attack other countries, you need a counter activities and counter possibilities to use your cyber weapon. This is not so expensive and not so destructive in the normal sense, but it needs some ingenuity and cooperation. If you still think that in Europe there is no cooperation between the different secret services of the different member countries of the European Union, even not of NATO, then you would see how the real defense would have to go, not individually with high costs, but in a common European defense structure with, of course, some basic rules that is not used for aggressive activities outside European soil, but for defense of European values and European countries and citizens.
Thank you for bringing up the very important issue of effectiveness and coordination, which is very often neglected. I see we have a question And then I also have like a last question and to close.
Thank you very much for this discussion. I have a question which I hope will give you some impetus to give some positive answers. Because you spoke a lot about how climate change actually triggers conflict. So I want to ask whether climate change can potentially bring forward more cooperation, and maybe like if it's difficult to speak about more cooperation and peace like on a big scale, yeah, but maybe you can provide some examples or suggest some venues where you can do it locally, maybe small communities, small settings or something like this. I was thinking if I myself know anything like this that happened before, but again, I just came up with that one example from Peru and Ecuador where they actually concluded peace and created this forest on the border that is now like a commonly managed area. But it's kind of a big thing, like it's done like by governments, but maybe even something smaller, something that can be like realistically done by normal people. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question that bring us back to the reality on the ground, and so the possibility to continue to work on some issues that will not, impact the world globally, but can have a local impact, and many small steps can have a great impact. And I think there are several examples, both of peace mediation and way of dealing with limited resources and climate change. I mentioned before farmer and herders in the Sahel. That is always a big issue, how to manage the limited resources, and often there are conflicts that are very localized, that are not very well known, like in North Nigeria, or in Burkina Faso, or in Central African Republic about that. And sometimes, it really need small measures sometimes to limit conflict and to improve the environmental situation. So, for instance, I work on an analysis in Central African Republic where the elders and farmers were fighting due to the overall situation in the country, where there is very poor governance, it's almost anarchy to some extent, a lot of weapons. But at the same time, some local organization coordinated with peacebuilding NGOs were able to mediate between herder and farmers, and for the herders they found some paths where they can cross by, avoiding to cross through the lands and destroy the lands, and that was really improving the situation, the relation between the two communities. It's something that usually the state institution and the political institution should do, but in that case, the governance was really limited, and the local communities were able, supported by some local and international NGOs, to do that and to manage. And I have in mind some peacebuilding organization. I think, for instance, to Humanitarian Dialogue. They broke some peace agreements between some communities in those areas, and that were really effective on the ground, even if they are not well known, are improving the life of the people, the managing of the resources, and so on. So I think we should continue also to stay at that level, even when the international situation is deteriorating. The big powers are fighting to build peace also locally. That's very important. Many times when I think for instance, to friends making questions, they always ask about extreme questions about China, about Russia, that of course are complex, and we have to deal with that question as well. But at the same time, there are so many situations that can be improved where the big powers are not directly involved, and the international community and the international NGOs can have a great impact on the ground, working with the local people and listening to the local needs.
Yes, thank you for a nice discussion. I also wanted to ask a question maybe for Mr. Swoboda about climate crisis in the Western Balkans. We know that the Western Balkans are actually one of the most polluted areas in Europe. And how do you see maybe the cooperation between the states and the people on the Western Balkans to change the situation and to improve the air quality and the quality of life generally in the Western Balkans, considering also that it's in the immediate neighborhood of the European Union?
Well, may I ask to give an answer to the two questions. The first question, of course, always in my mind are more missed chances. For example, look to the Nile when Ethiopia is building a big dam and the water is missing maybe to Egypt afterwards, or the other areas. But one area where there's a bit of glimpse of hope is the Middle East. Not that I'm very happy about the Abraham Accords as such, especially leaving out the Palestinians, but between Israel and the Arab Emirates, and also concerning Jordania, there is some cooperation on the water issue, on producing hydrogen. So there is, together with the energy, there is some, let's say, glimpse of hope I have that here peace could also be established by going into a more sustainable energy policy and environmental policy as such. Also the cooperation concerning the Eastern Mediterranean, when Israel, Palestine, Egypt, etc. are cooperating. Unfortunately, until now, still in a conflict with Turkey. But it would be a big chance if, for example, you would say Turkey, Cyprus, and it could involve both sides of Cyprus, if they would be ready, and Israel and Egypt, to use the energy found in this area and to use it together and exploit it together instead of fighting each other. So I think there is some chance, but also some missing chance. On the other issue, because I thought also about the Balkans, still it's not strong cooperation by state, but it could be triggered by different civil society groups who are complaining about the bad air in Sarajevo, about the quality of water in different countries, about investments, which is cancelled at least for the moment in Serbia from Rio Tinto and others. So I think the grassroots movements, especially in the Balkans, could bring a change if they could, in good cooperation with each other and supporting each other. Of course, you have to have some investments, you have to have some energy. But if it's done without respect for the natural environment and the health of the citizens, it doesn't work. So I think not yet a good example, but a good example of rising protests by people who are no longer swallowing and accepting decisions by the state if they are against their own interest, environmental interest or health interest.
Since we're coming to an end, I have my last question, and I also would like to look at a little bit a positive side. And so I'm asking for a wish. So what would be your wish for the next 10 years when it comes to climate crisis and peace building?
Well, thanks for this final positive remark and possibility to discuss about for the future. I mean, a positive projection could be to have a multilateral system that is really dealing with common issue. I think such a big crisis like the climate one is an opportunity for all to work together. And my hope is that we will be able to, as an international community, I mean, to be divided on many issues, to still discuss and be in disagreement, but at the end of the day, on some key issues like war or like the environment, we can agree on some, on 2, 3, 4 key points, and we try to improve and to change the course of history and to change the current environmental degradation. That's my hope. That on the one hand, on On the peace side, we can agree on more disarmament in the future. Even the big power can be back or to reality and think about that and connected to that to agree on some high standard for the future in terms of climate crisis prevention, let's say.
Hannes, your wish.
Well, I couldn't agree more. We have now a war, but it will have to end anyway sometimes. And we try now to decouple the West from Russia, and there are many who want to decouple from China. And on some supply chains, it's perhaps good if you are not too reliable, or you don't have to rely too much on other countries. But on environment, we have to rely on the cooperation of other countries. Therefore, I think we already now, even in this situation where there are many cuts and divisions, we should think about a renewal of our common engagement for the climate. And I think the next conference will be, the climate conference will be Sharm el-Sheikh. If it's the best place, it's another issue we will see. But anyway, we should not give up the hope that also after this dreadful war, there will be a common responsibility for the climate and for peace in the world.
Thank you very much to both of you. It was very interesting for me to discuss the whole nexus between climate crisis, peace building, security, environment. I think it is very often overlooked, and I think it is a very important and crucial topic for the future. And as you just said, it's our common future, and it's a global future. Thanks also for the cooperation with the Agency for Peacebuilding in Italy. I look forward to more cooperation. We have been live streaming the event. We will also publish it on our website and on YouTube, and you as well. And I wish you a nice evening, and thanks again, and stay safe.